Special Counsel Jack Smith plans to present evidence that shows former President Donald Trump used the support of Capitol rioters as part of an attempt to block the transfer of presidential power. In a new court filing, prosecutors highlight previous election denialism, the promise of January 6th pardons, music collaborations with jailed rioters, and more. CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett joins us now. Major, what did we learn today?
So this is a prosecution document. It is, if you will, a roadmap of what those prosecutors in March of next year, when this trial is supposed to begin, will allege against the former president.
Remember when all those legal experts were telling you that Trump was finished on immigration? Remember when they said the courts would stop him cold and his entire immigration agenda was dead on arrival with no chance of success? Remember when commentators across the media landscape were guaranteeing with absolute certainty that Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship would be struck down and forgotten forever, like it never even happened? Well, something just happened that flipped the entire script on his head, and nobody saw this coming at all. The Supreme Court just agreed to hear Trump's appeal on birthright citizenship, and this changes absolutely everything about where this fight is headed and what happens next for millions of families across America who are watching nervously. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
False then. Allegations of vote flipping false in 2020. They also go back to the debate, which I covered in 2016. In which then Republican nominee Donald Trump said he wasn't sure he would concede the election if Hillary Clinton was declared the winner. These things will be part of what the prosecution will allege.
Let me set the scene for you so everyone understands the full context of what just happened and why it matters so much for the future of this country and everyone living in it. Trump signed an executive order that would limit birthright citizenship for children born to undocumented immigrants on American soil. The lower courts, including a divided panel on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled that this order was unconstitutional because it contradicts the plain language of the 14th Amendment that has defined citizenship for over 150 years of American history. A federal judge in New Hampshire issued a preliminary injunction blocking the order from being enforced against babies born on or after February 20th, 25. The legal establishment was celebrating like they had won the entire war. The immigration advocates were declaring victory and telling everyone that this fight was completely over. Everyone thought this was done, and Trump had lost definitively with no realistic path forward to appeal. But here's what those experts didn't account for and what caught everyone completely off guard when it happened. Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, and the court agreed to take the case almost immediately, without any hesitation whatsoever. On December 5th, 2025, the Supreme Court accepted Trump's petition and put this case on the fast track for their current term, instead of letting it sit on the docket for months or years, like many other cases. Arguments will be heard soon, and a decision is expected by the end of June 2026 at the absolute latest. That means within 6 months, we could have a Supreme Court ruling that completely redefines who gets to be an American citizen and who doesn't, based on who their parents are. This isn't some distant hypothetical that might happen someday in the future anymore. This is happening right now, in real time, and the implications are staggering for millions of families who are watching and waiting nervously to learn their fate. Think about what this means for the narrative that's been pushed for months about Trump's legal situation and his ability to implement his agenda despite court opposition at every level. We've been told over and over by legal experts and media commentators that the courts would stop Trump from doing whatever he wants on immigration policy. We've been told that his executive orders were unconstitutional overreach that would never survive judicial review from serious judges who respect precedent. We've been told that the rule of law would prevail and Trump would be forced to back down on immigration enforcement like every other president before him who tried similar things. But now the highest court in the land has agreed to hear his argument on the merits, and this court has shown repeatedly over the past several years that it's sympathetic to Trump's positions on executive power and immigration policy enforcement. The Supreme Court didn't have to take this case at all. That's what makes this decision so significant and so revealing about where the justices might be leaning on the actual legal question. They could have simply declined to hear the appeal and let the lower court ruling stand as the final word on the matter forever without any further review. That's what courts do when they think the law is settled and there's nothing more to debate or examine at the highest level. But instead, at least 4 justices thought this case was important enough to put on the docket and hear full arguments from both sides about what the Constitution actually means. That signals that the conservative majority sees something here worth examining carefully and thoroughly. They see a legal question that might have a different answer than what the Ninth Circuit concluded in their ruling against Trump. And given this court's track record of siding with Trump on major cases involving executive power, that should make everyone pay very close attention to what happens next in this fight. This development ties directly into everything else happening with Trump's immigration agenda right now during his second term in the White House. The mass deportations that have dominated headlines since day one of the administration and sparked protests nationwide. The battles with federal judges over emergency removal policies that have created chaos at the border. The ongoing fights over asylum protections and border security that never seem to end no matter what anyone does. The Supreme Court has already sided with Trump in several of these fights, including a recent ruling that limited the ability of lower courts to block his policies through nationwide injunctions that stopped enforcement everywhere at once. So Trump isn't walking into a hostile courtroom here where the outcome is predetermined against him before he even speaks. He's walking into a Supreme Court that has given him wins before on similar issues and might be ready to give him another one on the biggest immigration question of them all. Who actually gets to be an American citizen? All right, let's really dig into the legal arguments here, because this case is going to come down to how the Supreme Court interprets a few key phrases in the Constitution. And those interpretations could reshape American citizenship for generations to come in ways most people haven't even begun to consider yet. Most people are only hearing the headlines and the sound bites without understanding the actual legal battle that's about to unfold at the highest level of our judicial system. So let me walk you through what both sides are arguing and why this case is so much more complicated and consequential than the media wants you to believe it is. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. For over 150 years, courts at every level, from district courts to appeals courts to the Supreme Court itself, have interpreted this to mean that anyone born on American soil automatically becomes a citizen, regardless of their parents' immigration status or national origin or anything else about their family situation. That interpretation was solidified in 1898 when the Supreme Court decided a landmark case called United States versus Wong Kim Ark, ruling that a child born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents was a citizen by birth under the Constitution, despite attempts to deny him that status. That precedent has stood for 127 years and has been applied consistently across different political eras and different court compositions through both Democratic and Republican administrations alike, without any serious challenge until now. But Trump's legal team is making a sophisticated argument that challenges this long-standing interpretation in ways that have never been seriously considered at the Supreme Court level before this case came along. They're focusing on that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and arguing that it doesn't just mean physically present and subject to American laws, like everyone has assumed for over a century of legal practice. They're arguing it means something more specific and more restrictive than the broad interpretation that has prevailed, complete allegiance to the United States without divided loyalties to any other country anywhere in the world. Under this interpretation, children born to undocumented immigrants wouldn't qualify for automatic citizenship because their parents still owe allegiance to their home countries and aren't fully subject to American jurisdiction in the constitutional sense the framers of the 14th Amendment originally intended when they wrote those words. The Ninth Circuit rejected this argument in very strong and unambiguous terms when they ruled against Trump's executive order earlier this year in a decision that seemed definitive at the time. The divided panel said the order is invalid because it contradicts the plain language of the 14th Amendment's grant of citizenship to everyone born on American soil, regardless of their parents' status. They didn't hedge their language or leave wiggle room for future reinterpretation by other courts. They said this executive order directly conflicts with what the Constitution says in clear terms and therefore cannot be enforced by any government agency under any circumstances. The federal judge in New Hampshire reached a similar conclusion when issuing the preliminary injunction that blocked enforcement against babies born after February 20th, 25. These lower court judges looked at the constitutional text and the century of precedent and concluded that Trump was trying to do something the Constitution simply doesn't allow a president to do through executive action alone without congressional approval or a constitutional amendment. But here's where it gets really interesting and why the Supreme Court's decision to take this case is so significant for the ultimate outcome of this fight that will affect millions. The conservative majority on this court has shown a willingness to reconsider long-held interpretations when they believe those interpretations don't match the original meaning of constitutional text as understood by the people who actually wrote it, generations ago. We saw this most dramatically with Dobbs, the case that overturned Roe v. Wade and eliminated the constitutional right to abortion that has stood for 50 years and been relied upon by millions of women making decisions about their own bodies. The court said that previous interpretations were simply wrong and needed to be corrected regardless of how long they had been in place or how many people depended on them for their lives and plans. If the justices approach birthright citizenship with the same originalist framework they used in Dobbs, they might conclude that Wong Kim Ark was wrongly decided back in 1898, or that it doesn't apply to children of undocumented immigrants specifically, even if it applies to children of legal immigrants. Trump's team is also making an argument about the scope of executive power that resonates deeply with this court's recent rulings on presidential authority in various contexts. They're saying the president has broad authority over immigration enforcement as commander-in-chief and chief executive of the federal government, and that this authority includes defining the parameters of who benefits from birthright citizenship in practical administrative terms that affect how agencies process documents and recognize status. Even if the Constitution grants citizenship to certain people born here, the argument goes, the executive branch has discretion over how that citizenship is recognized and documented and processed by federal agencies that handle these matters. It's a clever way of achieving the policy goal, even if the court doesn't fully embrace the constitutional reinterpretation that Trump is ultimately seeking through this case. And this court has been very sympathetic to arguments about expanded executive power in the immigration context, specifically over the past several years of rulings. The practical stakes of this case are enormous when you think about what happens to actual families depending on how the court rules next June when the decision comes down. Approximately 4 million babies are born in the United States every single year in hospitals and medical facilities across the country, from coast to coast. Under current law, every single one of them is automatically a citizen from the moment they're born, regardless of their parents' immigration status or how their parents entered the country years or decades earlier. If Trump wins this case, a significant portion of those babies could be denied citizenship based entirely on who their parents are and how their parents got here originally. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of children every year who would be born in America but wouldn't be recognized as Americans by their own government, despite being born on American soil. Many of these children would be effectively stateless, born in a country that doesn't claim them as citizens, but without citizenship anywhere else, either because they've never been to their parents' home countries and have no connection there. And this doesn't just affect future births going forward from when the ruling is issued. It raises terrifying questions about people who are already born under the current interpretation and have lived their entire lives as Americans believing they belonged here. If the court rules that children of undocumented immigrants were never actually entitled to birthright citizenship under a correct reading of the Constitution, what happens to the millions of people who have been living as American citizens their entire lives believing they belonged here like everyone else? Could their citizenship be retroactively revoked or questioned by the government years or decades after they were born? Could they suddenly find themselves undocumented in the only country they've ever known and called home their entire lives? The legal uncertainty this case creates extends far beyond the immediate policy question and touches fundamental issues of identity and belonging that affect real human beings. All right, let's break this down into the key points everyone needs to understand about where this case stands now and what happens next, because the situation is evolving rapidly and the stakes couldn't be higher for American immigration policy and constitutional law that will affect generations of people yet to be born. Point number one, the Supreme Court taking this case is itself a major victory for Trump that changes the entire dynamic of this legal fight in his favor immediately. The lower courts ruled against him decisively and without hesitation or doubt. The Ninth Circuit said his executive order contradicts the plain language of the Constitution in terms that couldn't be any clearer or more definitive. Legal experts across the political spectrum were saying his challenge was dead on arrival and had no realistic chance of success at any level of the judicial system. But the Supreme Court doesn't take cases unless at least 4 justices think there's something worth examining that the lower courts might have gotten wrong in their analysis. The fact that they agreed to hear this appeal signals that the conservative majority sees a legitimate legal question here and possibly an opportunity to reshape how birthright citizenship is understood going forward for everyone in America. Point number 2. This ruling could upend 127 years of constitutional interpretation and legal precedent if Trump prevails in his arguments before the justices when they hear the case. The Wong Kim Ark decision from 1898 has been the foundation of birthright citizenship law for over a century through every kind of political environment imaginable in American history. It's been applied consistently by courts at every level, from district courts to appeals courts to the Supreme Court itself, without any serious deviation. Overturning or significantly limiting that precedent would be one of the most dramatic constitutional shifts in modern American history, affecting millions of people. But this court has shown repeatedly it's willing to overturn long-standing precedents when it believes those precedents were wrongly decided. Just look at what happened with Roe versus Wade after 50 years of being settled law. So anyone who thinks Mark is safe simply because it's old and well established isn't paying attention to how this court actually operates. Point number 3. The phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof is going to be the battleground where this entire case is won or lost when the justices issue their ruling. Trump's team argues this phrase means complete allegiance to the United States, which would exclude children of undocumented immigrants whose parents owe allegiance to other countries by virtue of their foreign citizenship and nationality. Defenders of current law argue the phrase simply means subject to American laws, which includes virtually everyone present on American soil except diplomats with formal immunity from prosecution. How the Supreme Court interprets these 5 words will determine whether millions of people are citizens or not going forward from the date of the ruling. It's remarkable that such enormous consequences for so many people hang on the meaning of such a short phrase, but that's often how constitutional law works in practice when cases reach the highest court. Point number 4. This case is connected to Trump's broader strategy of testing the limits of executive power on immigration throughout his second term in office. We've seen this pattern play out repeatedly since he took office for the second time: push aggressive policies that challenge existing interpretations of law and precedent, get blocked by lower courts who apply traditional legal standards based on past rulings, appeal to the Supreme Court where the conservative majority is sympathetic to arguments about executive authority, win favorable rulings that expand what the executive branch can do going forward, regardless of who occupies the White House. The birthright citizenship challenge fits this pattern perfectly and follows the same playbook. Even if Trump doesn't get everything he wants from the court, even a partial victory would expand presidential authority over immigration in ways that would affect future administrations of both parties for decades to come. Point number 5. The timeline matters enormously for political implications heading into the 2026 midterm elections that will shape the rest of Trump's term. Arguments will be heard during the current Supreme Court term, and a decision is expected by June 2026 at the absolute latest when the term ends. That puts the ruling right in the heart of campaign season, when every congressional race will be influenced by national issues like immigration that drive voter turnout on both sides. If Trump wins, Republicans will campaign on their president's historic victory in reshaping citizenship law and fulfilling his promises to his base. If Trump loses, Democrats will campaign on his unconstitutional overreach and disregard for the Constitution he swore to defend when he took office. Either outcome will dominate political advertising and debate throughout the summer and fall campaign season leading up to November. Point number 6. Families across America are living in profound uncertainty right now, not knowing whether their children will be recognized as citizens when this is all over. The federal judge in New Hampshire blocked enforcement against babies born after February 2025, but that injunction only lasts as long as the legal fight continues in the courts and could be lifted at any moment. If Trump wins at the Supreme Court, all those children could suddenly have their citizenship status questioned or denied by the federal government. Parents who gave birth in American hospitals thinking their children were Americans from the moment of birth might discover that's no longer true under the new interpretation of the Constitution. The human anxiety created by this legal uncertainty is immense and affects real families making real decisions about their futures right now. Point number 7. This case will test whether any legal expert can reliably predict how this Supreme Court will rule on major constitutional questions anymore, given their track record of surprises. The conventional wisdom among legal scholars was that Trump's birthright citizenship challenge was hopeless because the precedent was so clear and the constitutional text seemed unambiguous to everyone who studied it seriously. But conventional wisdom has been wrong about this court before and might be wrong again this time too. They overturned Roe when many experts confidently said they wouldn't do it because the precedent was too established. They've sided with Trump on executive power when many experts predicted they'd rule against him based on past cases and traditional analysis. Anyone who's telling you with certainty how this case will turn out is ignoring the unpredictability that has defined this court's recent major decisions on controversial issues. So where does this leave us as we watch this historic case move toward argument and decision at the Supreme Court in the coming months? We're in a moment where the fundamental definition of American citizenship, who belongs and who doesn't, is genuinely up for debate at the highest level of our judicial system for the first time in over a century. For 127 years, the answer has been clear to everyone who looked at the question. If you're born here, you're one of us, regardless of where your parents came from or how they got here. But Trump is asking the Supreme Court to change that answer in a dramatic way that would affect millions. And this court, with its conservative supermajority and its demonstrated willingness to overturn long-standing precedent, has agreed to consider his argument seriously. The legal experts who guarantee Trump's downfall on this issue are watching their predictions crumble in real time before everyone's eyes. The lower court victories that seem so decisive and permanent are now just stepping stones to a Supreme Court battle that could go either way when the justices rule, and millions of families across America are waiting anxiously to learn whether the country they were born in will continue to recognize them as citizens or cast them out as strangers who don't belong here. This is why everyone needs to be paying attention to what happens next, in this case over the coming months, the arguments before the justices, the oral presentations from both legal teams, the questioning from the justices that might signal how they're leaning on the ultimate question. Every detail will be scrutinized and analyzed by legal experts trying to predict the outcome before it happens, and when the decision comes down in June, the consequences will reshape American society for generations to come. Stay tuned, because this story is reaching its climax, and what the Supreme Court decides will affect every single person in this country, whether they realize it right now or not. This is history being written in real time before our very eyes.